All right, so today is the second day of radicals. Yesterday, you should have remembered how to simplify square roots that are not perfect squares. So today we're going to throw some variables in there. Variables are actually very easy to simplify. The first step is if it is a multiple of 2, then all you have to do is take the exponent and divide it by 2. So in this case, my exponent is m. So I'm just going to do m divided by 2. And then that will give me my answer. However, if it's not a multiple of 2, it does get a little complicated. I know this formula is kind of confusing, so we'll do several examples together. Now, if it's not a multiple of 2, you make it a multiple of 2, having 1 left over. All right? So whenever it is not a multiple of 2, just note that you're going to have leftovers. Okay? So, number 1, this is a multiple of 2. So, I have 2 divided by 2. What is 2 divided by 2 is just x1. So, if you want to put just x or x1. Looking at m to the 6, I have m. 6 divided by 2 gives me m to the 3rd. Okay? So, the square root means we're just going to divide the exponent by 2. Looking at number 3, I have a number in here, so always worry about your number first. What is the square root of 9? Well, I know that 3 times 3 is 9, so that's going to give me 3. And then I have k, 2 divided by 2 just gives me 1k, or k1. Number 4, the square root of 64 is 8. And then if I have 4 p's, I'm going to divide that by 2. Now I have p squared. All right, so let's look at some larger. Number 5, what is the square root of 100? It is 10. If I have 2 x's, divide that by 2, I have 1. 2 y's, divide that by 2, now I have 1. Number 6, what is the square root of 49? It is 7. I have 2 a's, so I'm going to divide that by 2, gives me 1. b6 divided by 2 gives me b3. c4 divided by 2 gives me c2. All right, so here you should notice if it's a multiple of 2, it's actually fairly easy. All right, so let's look at 7. 7's where it gets a little bit more complicated because it's an odd. Well, I have y5 is the same as y4 and y, correct? So if I take the square root of y4, that gives me y2. I have 1 left over, so it stays under the radical. Okay? Like I said, if it is not a multiple of 2, you're always going to have a leftover. So look at A. A2 divided by 2 gives me just A. When I do B3, I'm going to have B squared with 1B left over. All right? That gives me a B, because 2 divided by 2 gives me 1, but I still have this left over, so I write it like that. All right, so my final answer here should be A and B on the outside, but there's 1B left over. All right, so for number 9, I have an even here and an even here. So I know that those will have no leftovers. The y, however, is going to have a leftover. So I have x2 gives me just x1. Now y is now y squared and y. So 2 divided by 2 gives me just 1y. But I do have this leftover. I'm not going to use it yet. Let's look at z4. 4 divided by 2 is 2. So I have z2. And then you don't forget about your leftover y. So that is your final answer. Okay. All right, let's add a number to it. So what is the square root of 144? I have 12. And then I have k3. So I know I have k2 and k. K2 is going to simplify to just k, but my leftover goes under the radical. Okay. All right, we are going to flip it over to the back and trying to simplify numbers and radicals. So looking at 13. I want to start with 13. The square root of 8. Now, remember, we're looking at those perfect squares. 8 is not a perfect square, but I do know that 4 is a perfect square. So all I'm focused on is the 8. Break up the 8 like you did yesterday. What's the square root of 8? 8 breaks up into the square root of 4 and 2, because 4 times 2 is 8. What's the square root of 4? I have 2. My radical 2 comes down. Okay? Now let's worry about our x to the 6. Well, I have x, 6 divided by 2 gives me x3. Now, is my x3 under the radical? No. So it's going to go right here in between my x, or my 2 and my radical 2. Okay. Remember, if you have a leftover, it would have went under the radical with the 2. All right, number 14, the square root of the square root of 50. I need to break it up into a perfect square of 25 and 2. What is the square root of 25? 5. Radical 2 comes down. Notice I leave a space because there might be a variable there. So I have x2 divided by 2 gives me just x. There are no leftovers, so I just put the x in front of the 5. All right, number 15. Notice that it is an odd. That means that you are going to have a leftover. So 68, we need to try to simplify. Well, I know that 68 breaks up into 4 and 17. 4 is a perfect square, so it works out. So I have 4, square root of 4 is 2. I'm going to leave a space, and I'm going to do square root of 17. I'm going to make my radical a little longer because I do know that 3 is going to have a leftover, so there's going to be something in that spot right there. So I have p to the third, which is the same as the square root of p squared and p. Well, the squared, this one now becomes just a p because we divide it by 2. But because I have this leftover, it needs to go under the radical. If it's outside of the radical, it counts as 2. So here I have 2 right here, 1 here gives me 3. All right. 16. 45 is the same as the square root of 9 and the square root of 5. What times what is 9? 3. Radical 5 goes on the inside. Now I have 11. So I know 11 is actually 5.5. If I divide it by 2, I get 5.5. So I know that 5 are going to go on the outside and a half goes on the inside. Whenever you have a remainder, it always goes on the outside. So some people like to see this as n to the 11 over 2, which is 5.5. So 5 n's have to go on the outside here, and then I have a half, which goes on the inside. All right, so let's look at 18. 18 is going to be our last one. If I do the square root of 180, I know that that's going to be 36 and 5. Now x, I have 3 divided by 2, which is 1.5. So that tells me that I'm going to have 6 with 1x on the outside. My y, 8 divided by 2 gives me 4. So I'm going to have y4. Y4. And then in the square root, I have a 5. And then I have a half left over, so that goes on the inside.